the time of avaricious men, lost in their lust for power, baby. Here they come again. They wave the flag and smile to distract us from the truth. But we pay like hell for the lies they tell. The thieves are on the loose. Don't go along with that. Land of the free. That's the way we give away our liberty. Well, hi, everybody. Indeed, this is the time of avaricious men, and some women are in there too. But we're going to have our predictably great time tonight. Hopefully, we have really good quality audio for everything as well. Sometimes when people are in other countries, there are some problems that occur and can happen in this country. But for the most part, we have been getting fairly good audio, and hopefully the video is improved because that was pretty crappy for a while. So tonight, we've got a very interesting guest. And before I get to our guest, I saw something posted on my blog in the comments section that really resonated with me. First, I'll just read it, and I won't have to explain too much, I don't think, especially to people who are familiar with this material and with the ongoing effort of people who are involved in the mission in trying to, in a responsible way, communicate it, live the principles, experiment, study the teaching, and then running into the strange dissonance, that might be the way to put it, the strange dissonance in the world when things that are simply truthful and can be easily self-determined to be the truth are presented in the midst of the garbage. So here's what I was reading today. Since the 1940s, we have been living in the prophesied time of cold hearts, with its warlike political and cult religious turmoil, philosophical and ideological contradictions, as well as social and societal disharmony. The earthly present, I love that, of modern times stands in stark contrast to billions of years of creation-oriented spiritual teaching. This often very strenuous balancing act between everyday life on earth and the study and knowledge of spiritual teaching and the peaceful existence of extraterrestrial visitors is a discrepancy that is particularly noticeable for the many human beings who are close to FIGU, the organization that Billy has founded. They are the ones who try to combine both worlds in their earthly lives, dealing with and connecting these very contrasting worlds often requires a very tactful sensitivity between sensible silence and conscious public behavior. The open-minded human beings in the inner and outer circles in and around the FIGU are often very challenged to harmonize these two opposing worlds in their own lives, but to do so without resenting the obtuseness and unreasonableness of Earth's humanity or despairing of the earthly lack of understanding for the real truth. Now, for those of you who come across this and aren't familiar with the spiritual teaching, the creation energy teaching in this material, the Billy Meier material, I really suggest that you look into it and you'll understand even more, perhaps not only why this is expressed by somebody who's a student of this teaching, but why you find this dissonance, this obtuseness and unreasonableness of Earth's humanity, and you may have found yourself despairing of the earthly lack of understanding for the real truth. You may have found this in your own life, or you may find it arising, and you can reflect, if you will, on this sensitivity and sensibility. So with that having been said, I do want to introduce tonight's guest. And Erik Rush is a friend online. We haven't met in person-to-person space, but we've communicated online. We visited in video before. And I think Erik has a very, very interesting story to tell, something to share with us that is unique in certain ways, because he's got a lot of components to put together that'll enlighten us about his journey here. So what I want to do is right now introduce Erik. Erik, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Yes,
Thanks
sir.
for having me on. It's
Yeah,
great to be here. Nice to see you.
nice to see
I'm
you
here.
too. Good. You're really right there. Imagine this part worked. Okay, so what I want you to do is let's do some of the basic biographical background, such as where did you grow up? What was your basic childhood experience in life about? Take it away.
Okay, well, I was born in New York City, right there on Manhattan Island in 1961. I was a child of a white father, black mother, which made it kind of interesting when I was growing up in terms of forming my cultural perspective. You know, we grew up just outside, or I have one sister. We grew up just outside of New York City. And an interesting, I guess, a little factoid is that we actually lived in the same neighborhood as the widow and children of slain civil rights leader Malcolm X. So even though I didn't really learn about him and what all of that meant until I was like a teenager, I was on a first name, our families were on first name bases for most of my life, even though I haven't seen them for years. I mean, I'd probably go to New York and see them and they'd go, "Oh, hi, Erik." Um, so that was interesting. Um, my mom ran an African dance and drum troupe when I was growing up. And so I was, you know, the arts were a big factor in my life. We were fortunate enough to have a piano in the house. I sat down at the age of 6 and just started picking out songs that I had heard on the radio. Um, Both of my folks were very into music. My dad was, in addition to getting me into science fiction, because he was a big science fiction buff, he was into jazz mostly, had a great love of music. My folks had seen some of the greats perform when they were young people, you know, people like, you know, Buddy Rich and Gene Krupa and Coltrane and Peggy Lee and all these people I just listened to growing up. And so between that and my mom playing a little classical and the Afro-Cuban influence from my mom's dance troupe, it was like there was always music, always musicians and dancers and people around, which made for a very, very rich experience. Um, I, you know, got into music. I
Well,
played a lot. Yeah.
before the music, going farther into music, what I'd like to do, it just crossed my mind that I know what you're talking about in a few areas here, but tell those people who don't know a little bit about who Malcolm X was. You knowing the family, you know, the widow.
Oh, yeah.
Please tell us.
Yeah. Well, Malcolm X had been, you know, he was a, you know, a black man. He had been in his early life a petty criminal who got reformed in prison and joined the Nation of Islam, which is a kind of a very straight-laced but rather somewhat activist group. You know, I'm not going to go into what their beliefs are, but they're loosely tied to Islam with some more esoteric stuff thrown in. And he actually wound up becoming a leader in the movement. One of pretty much like the number two guy next to Mr. Muhammad, who was running it at the time. Now, of course, it's Louis Farrakhan, but they were very prevalent in the area, I guess, in a lot of the big cities, and they were pretty much a separatist movement. I mean, they thought that blacks should keep to themselves and whites should keep to themselves, and they were very down on what the inequities that existed in the social structure of the United States. And he got a lot of airplay. He was very articulate and very congenial. And so he got, I mean, you could see him during the 60s on these TV talk shows that where they would be discussing racial issues, which were very front and center at the time. He, after a pilgrimage to some of the Arabic countries, his mind sort of opened up, and he started seeing things a bit differently, because he was saying, wow, there are white Muslims and brown Muslims and in addition to black Muslims. And he sort of gravitated away from the Nation of Islam, which was becoming in some respects a little more militant, but not overtly so, like, say, the Black Panthers, which came later. As a lot of folks may know, Alex Haley, the man who wrote Roots, which became this big blockbuster in movies, wrote the biography of Malcolm X and did a lot of work with him. As he gravitated away from the Nation of Islam, he ran afoul of some of their teachings and was in the process of sort of starting his own thing when he was gunned down in a theater in Harlem in front of an audience and his family, which was the story that I heard growing up. And to me, it was, as a kid, it was like, oh, wow, that's terrible, seeing your dad gunned down, whatever. Later on, I learned of his significance in the civil rights arena.
I wasn't all that, immersed, if you will, in the movement of civil rights or anything else at the time. I was simply aware. If you look this is the only photograph in color that I had of this particular painting, but if you look in the upper right-hand corner of it, there's a man's head back at an angle.
Yeah.
That was my rendition of Malcolm X. I think I painted this in '64 or something like that. And below him I painted in the archetypical Southern American white racist guy. And then there was the guy with the, what do you call it? The halo around him, the fake piety of religion. And then, and then above him was a guy with a football helmet worshiping the football gods. And all this stuff I was painting back in the 60s, and it was just because it was probably more in my, what I like to call my subconscious mind, than it was in my conscious mind. But all this stuff was coming out, so it's enough of that for right now. But there it was. So I haven't met anybody that was that close to, Malcolm X or the people involved. Now, you grew up after, I guess, after he had been assassinated. You were in your teen years then, or no?
When he was, let's see, he was assassinated, I think it was 63.
Yeah.
I mean, I would have been 2 at the time. So as I said, I didn't really understand who he was until I was a teenager, in the early 70s. But growing up around his kids and hearing the story, there was a certain amount of empathy there for like, oh my gosh, to see your father shot in front of you, yikes.
Sure.
And I actually had a kind of a mini crush on one of the daughters when I was growing up, because she was gorgeous.
Oh, beautiful, I'm sure. Or I could also say beautiful, because I wanted to put this blue screen up for a little bit instead of my silver one. So this is kind of cool, because I went to New York City probably for the first time in my life in about 1957 or 58. And then I moved there in something like 66 or 67 and lived there for several years. And I got, you mentioned the music scene. Tell me more about your experience in the music scene and all that.
Well, I'm, as I said, self-taught musician, and I've always, I guess, sort of gravitated to the more right brain stuff, like music. And I played a lot, as I came into my teenage years. Like most of my peers, I guess we decided that we were going to be the next generation of rock and roll stars. So I was pretty much dedicated to that until I was maybe 24 or 25, and wound up doing. I was playing in clubs in New York before I was even old enough to be in them, and did that. I wound up playing several instruments. I'd get backstage at shows if I didn't know the band. I mean, we opened for a name act or two, the band I was in at the time. And if we didn't know the band at a venue, we could bribe the guy in the back so we could get backstage and hang out with the band, So I wound up getting, sort of hobnobbing with a lot of people who are, I guess, legendary, I suppose, at this point. But it was just, it was all in good fun. And in my view, on the road to stardom. But and I was working a day job in my late teens through my 20s, which is how I blundered into biomedical research, which is a big part of my story, and definitely helped to shape my perspective on science and scientists. But yeah, I just did that probably until I was about 24 and 25, before I wound up relocating to Colorado.
Well, what you were in a rock band, if I understand.
Several of them.
And so who were some of the people of the time that were rock and roll stars that you were either in, playing on the same bill with, or in the same club, or what have you? I'm kind of curious about it.
Oh, well, Journey was one of them. They were kind of a fusion rock band before they hired Steve Perry to their front man, who's very famous. And their early albums, of course, nobody knows about, because they were totally unlike what they wound up doing for FM radio. Mm-hmm. So I hung out with them quite a bit, because I actually knew someone who knew someone in the band, and kind of got in with them. But there were a lot of bands that we sort of hung out with peripherally when they came through town, because New York is New York, and if you really want to, you can find those people. A lot of bands we met. We opened up for Pat Travers, who was kind of a big party band guy, sort of the Jimmy Buffett vein, sort of a poor man's Jimmy Buffett, if you will. Kansas, we bribed the guy to get backstage there once. Rick Derringer did a cameo appearance in a video for my band in 1985, which was very exciting.
Was Rick Derringer the guy who, in the Hang On Sloopy rock and roll thing?
The McCoys, Hang On Sloopy, he sang that. Later on, he wound up playing with Edgar Winter and Johnny Winter. They were very tight. And so I was in Rick Derringer's house, hanging out with him and talking about, my future and whatnot. Yeah.
My connection to that is that the guy that wrote the song, Hang On Sloopy, he ended up putting out a record of mine. And then he went, and he went in the studio with a singer to record a song I wrote, and they played it back to me over the phone. I'm living in what was it, 16th Street in Manhattan, and it was fantastic. It was arranged by Herb Bernstein, who was a really good arranger of the time. And I thought, wow, I'm going to have this song out. And then the singer, whose name is Carly Simon, left.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, got mad at the producer, and the record never came out. I've got tons of my own, music business stories, the Brill Building and all that stuff, but I haven't met anybody else that was doing, any of that stuff at the time. And here you are, maybe at a different time or close to a different time, and you would know what I'm talking about. And I know a little about what you're talking about. I wasn't that much into rock and roll, but I know the names that you're throwing around. Well,
yeah.
Let me ask you this. So you got into science fiction, I think, when you were still relative.
Yes. Very pretty early age. As I said, my dad was a big science fiction buff. He had read, he had bookshelves full of those paperbacks that he had read when he was in college or wherever, all the greats, Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, all this stuff. So when I was around, I was a preteen, I suppose, 11 maybe, I just started pulling them off the shelf and going and seeing, is this any good? And whoa. And it just like opened my mind to possibilities. Now, you have to understand, this is at the same time that the space race is on, they're going to the moon. I'm watching first run Star Trek episodes when I'm 6 years old. So, the influence started early. I started picking up the books when I was more like, 10 or 11 and devouring this science fiction stuff, which I know that between that and some of the more esoteric cultural influences I had from my mother's side of the family really left me, I think, a lot more open-minded to possibilities and things that maybe the average Westerner thought were a little out there. And so, yeah, that was a really big part of my life. And I don't know if I read anything other than, stuff that was required reading in school that wasn't science fiction until I was, in my mid-20s. I was very, very into it.
So is that kind of a launching pad in a way, let's say, for getting into spirituality as well as science and all that?
Yes, I believe it was, because, even though, like a lot of people who are spiritual seekers, if you will, there are a lot of dead ends that you can go down, but it definitely did open me up to that world and that sort of possibility, as one of your guests, and I thought it was really amazing that one of your guests, I don't know if it was the last one or the one just before that, was talking about how he used to watch Kung Fu with David Carradine years ago. And I used to watch Kung Fu with David Carradine years ago. And what got me about that was the serenity of the character. And I realize it's fiction, it's TV, but the serenity of the character and his sense of justice and how he always protected people who were being downtrodden, and yet don't mess with him because he'll take you apart. And I just thought that, are there really people out there like that who are really into is there another world? Is there a spiritual world that they talk about, and is anyone speaking the truth? Um, and even though I did later on get into mainstream religion, I was always open to different things. Even when I was in mainstream religion, I was always reading other texts of other faiths. And, even though I didn't necessarily subscribe to it, I always found it very interesting. And I was always kind of looking.
Mm. What do you think was driving this? I mean, I understand the connection between the how can I put it, the sci-fi, the spirituality, in a way, and then kung fu comes in there, because you mentioned that maybe again a lot of people don't know about that show because of the time that it was hot on the air. I was attracted to that show too. As a matter of fact, a cousin of mine ended up writing a what do you call it, an episode of that. I don't remember which one. And he was the cousin that got me into Tai Chi, and all these things were connected. So what do you think? I mean, there's so many links, there's so many pieces in in your life, the things that you have been involved with, and I know we're going to get into some more. What was the next step then? What happened next, so to speak?
Well, I was introduced, once again, I was always curious about martial arts because of the self-improvement aspects, as well as having been a little kid in one of the smallest kids in my class the whole time I was growing up, and wanted to be able to defend myself. Not that I got beat up all the time, but I just thought it was, that and the health aspects. So I started in martial arts in my 20s. Did a lot of some Kobudo, some Shotokan, and settled into Taekwondo in my 20s. And that was obviously has health benefits and discipline benefits. But, I was always just as much into it for the mental discipline and the spiritual enlargement as I was for everything else. As I was studying these different spiritual schools of thought, because I didn't really, I guess because I didn't really see any alternative, I did what a lot of people who are looking for spirituality do. I wound up plugging into mainstream religion for 30 years.
Boy.
Yeah.
Okay. Would you like to share anything about that particular journey? What did you get? What particular religious path were you involved in?
Well, I mean, I'm not, I don't subscribe to that any longer, but I plugged into a mainstream denominational, Christianity. And there were a number of different reasons for that. Spiritual curiosity being first and foremost among those. But I think that it's really curious to me now in retrospect, and particularly in the context of the Billy Meier material, is that the entire time that I was involved in the church, I was still reading and studying things of people of other faiths. Buddhist texts, I read part of the Quran. And even when I started, and I was still very much in the church when I started reading the contact reports and the Billy Meier material. And it didn't turn me off. You know, I sort of glossed over the parts where they talk about the spiritual teaching and that there are no celestial beings smiling down on us and all of this. And I contextualized it in the, with the rationale of, well, this may be right, but God is above all of that, But I'm reading all of this material and really studying it pretty closely, going through the contact reports and the all of the other material, although I hadn't started buying the books yet. And I was like, this stuff all makes sense. And this stuff is answering a lot of my questions. It's answering questions that I had since I was a little child. Now, remember, this cultural sort of awareness that I had from when I was growing up led me to sort of, I tend to think of things in terms of systems. And one of the things that had bugged me ever since I was a kid was, scientists, and of course, I'm working with scientists at this point and had been for years. Scientists tell us that we started in Africa and we all grew out of there, and people's appearance all changed because they went to different regions and the environment made them turn into white people or what we know as Asian people. Or I never bought that. I never bought into that. I was like, I don't think that one thing would give rise to the other. Of course, now I know better.
Right.
And then there were a lot of things that were sort of anomalous in terms of what science had been telling me for my entire life. Yet there are questions that they can't answer. For example, and then if they don't know, they'll either shrug their shoulders, or in most instances, they'll just make something up, And I became aware working in biomedical research that some of the people who work in there, and I've worked for some top-notch guys. I mean, I worked for some researchers who were the biggest on their planet, in their field on the planet. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying these guys are all about ego. They're very capricious. They will destroy their colleagues if they run afoul of their pet theories. And so I'm experiencing this, and then I make this connection, also as I'm reading the contact reports, some of the most dastardly people in the history of the, Pleiadians were scientists. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking at these guys that we have talking to us on the TV and in the media, and I'm thinking, yeah, they could become as power crazed and as dastardly as some of the people that I'm reading about.
Well, speaking of, power crazed scientists and TV and all that, let us know a little bit about how you became a commentator for a major network.
Well, that's another interesting story. I mean, as I said, I've always been right-brained. I was always into writing, music, all of these professions that if you don't do well, if you don't become a wild success, you wind up living in a Maytag box. But I always liked to write. I'd be writing short stories while I was supposed to be studying in class and things of this nature. And I think because I've always had a sense of systems and empathy and justice and all that, I was looking at the world and where it was going. It was really strange that through a lot of these years that I'm playing rock and roll music and hanging out with people, a lot of them are stoners and druggies and whatnot. I have this core of friends. We'd sit over in a corner and they didn't do that stuff. They talked politics. They talked what was going on in the world. They talked about social issues. And I guess because I cared about what was going on, I sort of gravitated into writing political commentary. And while I did tend to gravitate more to the right, although that that made for some cognitive dissonance. But I was writing for some local papers and things of that nature, and some online web stuff in the early 2000s. And actually, there was a little bit of overlap with that, my last research job. But they had this fellow who was coming out and was going to run for president, a fellow named Barack Obama. And I did a little bit of research on him just because that's what I do. Mm-hmm. And I came across this, I came across the website of the church that he went to at the time, Trinity United Church in Chicago. And I looked at their website, and it was basically a lot of Black nationalist stuff, in my view. And, I had been raised with the, people are people. I've got a white father, Black mother. People are people. Some people are idiots. Some people are not. And the militancy that came out of the Black consciousness movement was something that I didn't go for because it was violent. Just as I didn't go for the Klan because they were violent, or the white nationalists. And so I wrote an article about Trinity United Church in Chicago, Obama's church, and I figured people will find it interesting because he goes there. The next thing and it got published. The next thing I know, I get a call from the producer of what was then Hannity and Combs on Fox News. And they're like, we're going to send a car for you, take you down to Denver so you can talk to Hannity and Combs. I'm like, okay. So the rest, as they say, is history, because the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, who was the pastor there, that became one of the kind of sticking points to Obama getting nominated, because everyone was asking him, what about this militant pastor you got? And they sort of glossed over it. And he was a media darling by then, and he was going to be our first Black president. And so that sort of died down. But what happened on my end was that I kept getting radio interviews, TV appearances, et cetera, et cetera. I never wound up getting a high-paying, network gig out of it, but did gain some notoriety and did get a steady, writing gig online for quite a few years.
Well, this is, rare. I mean, we don't have these stories with most of our friends. We don't know anything about this. And, this whole thing with the media, you may know, I try to get the Meier material into the mainstream media.
Yeah.
Recently, I was actually contacted by 3 different pretty good-sized PR firms. And, they wanted me to call and discuss doing PR with them. And
yep.
I did. And each time I spoke to the person who was going to vet this, they were genuinely, I got excited about getting this out there. Wow, that's fascinating information. And one of them, I knew they were legit in their enthusiasm. They offered me a 2-for-1, we'll give you a free article too. And I go, okay, well, let's see what happens. So naturally, 2 of them proceeded to try to get a PR out, and they could not get into the publications because, in case people don't know, and that's why I'm taking time to tell this, the media, and especially any mainstream media, publication, TV, anything else, has people in it who are there to monitor that certain things do not get into the news.
Yes.
Right? You know this.
Yes.
So the third guy that contacted me just last week, after I told him all this information, he was trying to figure out, well, how did we ever get in touch with you? He said, I can tell you right now, we're not going to be able to get this in the media. And I said, yeah, well, you're one of the few people to recognize that right off the bat, but at least I got to do my story to you as a journalist, you know. And he said, yeah, well, you know, I'm sorry. And I said, yeah, well, you might want to study this because it's going to affect you and your family and the rest of the country and the world. Whether it's the powers that be want it to come out, they think they can, like Billy says, there's not enough shovels to bury the truth. And I keep on trying. But
yes.
And what I also know, and I'm going to give you, just want to get this out. This so-called UFO community, these people in Congress, they're now complaining that they can't get the info that they're demanding from the government. And I'm sitting here going, I've sent you the best info you will ever see. You don't have to rely on the government for its disinformation. I've been in touch with one office for a Republican representative who the person said, oh, send us, that sounds fascinating, you know, the usual. Of course, no mention after that. So your story, it rings true, it at least brings up for me.
Yes.
My own kind of experience.
And well, you see, one of the things that wound up souring me on politics was exposure to insiders there. I mean, as a result of the writing that I'm doing, I'm traveling, I'm going on these shows, I'm meeting people in Congress, I'm meeting retired generals and admirals and UN ambassadors and former, you know, intelligence operatives. And the things that I'm learning is that they're all the same. You know, they're this whole left-right paradigm. It's theater. It's theater. There people don't understand that when they go to vote for someone, they're not really voting for someone. They're voting for an approved candidate. You know, in terms of that media thing you're describing, you know, you may get somebody who's a little low down on the food chain or an assistant producer or whatever, run across the Billy Meier material or something else that's controversial and go, whoa, this is interesting. And they'll send it to their producer, and their producer may say, yeah, this is interesting, let's run with this. Sooner or later, it comes across someone's desk. And, you know, as you and I know, there are intelligence operatives embedded in these networks as well. And I'm sure that you and I came by that information in two different, you know, separately. But sooner or later, it gets to, you know, someone high up enough who says, you know, we can't have this out there. And as you know, to borrow a phrase from that we see so many times in the contact reports, since time immemorial, these people have been squashing this stuff, and that's what they're doing right now, or at least attempting to. You know, in an age we're living in now, they're not going to be able to do it as successfully or as completely as they used to, but you know, they're going to try.
And they'll have a great oppressive tools, even greater, at their disposal. They already do. So with these experiences you've had, what happened 20 plus years ago that created certain difficulties in your life? What did you get into that you had to get out of?
Well, as I never made any secret of this, even when I was writing political commentary, because I think that it tends to help humanize the person who's writing or commenting. If people don't think they, you know, live a charmed life, you know, I never made a secret of the fact that I grew up with alcoholism in the home. My dad, though he was a brilliant man and I loved him dearly, was a raging alcoholic and probably a malignant narcissist as well. But you know, when I hit my early 40s, which, well, 20 years ago, I came to the conclusion that I was in danger of going down the same path. So I got into recovery and I got sober. And interestingly enough, that is what led me to the Billy Meier material.
Really?
There are, in addition to the various types of media and material and books that people read, or when they're looking at recovery or in recovery, there are certain films and books and media that are sort of cult interest, I guess you might say, that are just popular sort of within those circles. And I came across this book by this fellow whose name I cannot pronounce. And it's called We Are All Connected, or We Are All Related. And it's by a Native American gentleman who encountered a lot of the things that Native Americans do when they come up in modern America: military service, alcoholism, that sort of stuff. And he then got on a spiritual path, sort of got back to his Native American roots. Now, toward the end of this book, and it's almost like an afterthought, the way it reads, because it's very conversational. He starts talking about, yeah, there's this guy in Switzerland, and I don't even know, I'd have to go through it again. I don't even know if he names Billy Meier by name, but he talks about the Pleiadians. And he says, yeah, they've been coming here for millennia. And they've been visiting this man for, at the time of publication, I guess it was about 40, 50 years, and visiting with him. And they are here to help us not destroy ourselves, essentially, and grow spiritually. And yeah, at the time, it took him about 7 hours to get here from the Pleiades. And I read that and I was like, whoa, this looks interesting. And that was about 15 years ago that I picked up that book. And I immediately got online and started finding bits of the contact reports and information on Billy Meier. And the rest is history. I devoured, I love reading, fortunately. I devoured the contact reports, and even though some of it sort of wasn't in sync with, my religious beliefs at the time, more and more of it started to make sense. And then with the validation, the hard scientific evidence, these photos are real, these videos are real. Other people have seen these things and experienced these things. And I just had to, say, as I was, going through all of this, that if this makes sense, there's a high probability that that makes sense. We started to throw a little bit of question into, my religious beliefs, but something else was happening at the same time as well. Now, even though I was no longer doing, drinking and drugging and all of that nonsense, I was still having a lot of problems with what I understand now as psychic damage, but things like depression and high levels of anxiety and so on and so forth, which came to a head about 5 or 6 years ago. And I came to the realization I needed to seek some help for that. And I wound up learning that I had, this unresolved childhood trauma from being raised with this raging alcoholic, which is unfortunately has become almost passé in our society. But, there being a continuum of damage, it isn't everyone who who grows up with an alcoholic who winds up, having a complete psychic breakdown. But as I learned more about unresolved trauma and things of that nature, at least as far as what we understand here on Earth in 21st century medicine and psychiatry and all of that, in addition to learning how feeble our understanding of the human mind is, I started noticing that this sort of psychic damage is pretty prevalent in our society. Um, there are a lot of uh, recovery groups and things of this nature, which have had unprecedented success in helping people who are addicted to whatever it is, whether it's alcohol, drugs, food, um, but central to a lot of that is um, mainstream spirituality, which on earth means God belief. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. What do you tell someone who's, 1 foot in the grave and the other on a banana peel with their addiction? Don't go there. Well, they might fix you, but you might wind up, a religious zealot as well. So I've sort of had to fine tune that in terms of my own recovery, but what it came down to was my realization that we're a really sick society. We don't treat each other very well, which of course dovetails very nicely into the spiritual teaching. Our thinking is fear-driven, ego-based, because of the way that we think. And of course, this is, elaborated on in great detail in the creation energy teaching. And I came to realize that, if people truly knew, I mean, people don't understand our true nature. I mean, the majority of people on earth don't understand our true nature. And if they did, they would think and act differently, which is, of course, what the mission is all about.
Yes. Yes. Amazing. You've taken this trip and you've done like a full cycle to arrive somewhere now that is its own life in a way. I mean, the teaching and finding the balance that it brings forward, you seem to be, to me, involved with that and expressing that. I really appreciate that you've taken the time to go into this, for us. Do you have any other thoughts that you want to share before we close?
Well, only one really is, and the reason that I did want to bring that out there is because, well, for one thing, I don't want to, soft soap the fact that it's been difficult. When you have this sort of thing, these sorts of things in your life, it's difficult to come back from, and a lot of people don't. A lot of people either fall back into their addiction, or they check out, commit suicide, what have you, things of that nature. And I know that, in the psyche, the book The Psyche, and Billy talks about that at great length, some people just fall through the cracks, unfortunately, because they don't know a better way. And for anyone who has had, for whom life has thrown them maybe a few more curves than their neighbor, there is healing in the creation energy teaching. I mean, I was reading through the book The Psyche for the second time a couple weeks ago, and I came to the conclusion that even if that book only contained the last 2 chapters, it would be worth buying. At least for me, it would be worth having, because the understanding that you get about us and about healing and about the mind and all of that, to me, has been indispensable. Meditation to me is indispensable. It's not optional. And for anyone, I'm sure I'm not going to be unique, among people who come to the creation energy teaching who have had some sort of trauma in their life, whether or not they freely discuss it or not, that don't let that be an impediment to your healing, to your learning. and jump in with both feet or one toe at a time, like I did. And there's just so much to learn. It has made just an incredible difference in my life over the last 5 years and the years before that, studying, in terms of the knowledge I've gleaned.
Well, I thank you very, very much. This has been a fascinating conversation. I don't like to say interview so much. It's a conversation that I think there are a lot of people who can and will relate to various aspects, as well as to the whole overall context of your life, but to certain things that there are these bullet points, or if we had a gong and hit them every now and then, we'd get this image that's floating around behind us here.
Yeah.
I can relate to a lot, to a lot of these things too, not just the ones that I said, well, I had a connection to that, but the trials and tribulations. I was homeless in New York City, and all that stuff, and a little bit in San Francisco and LA as well. So when you find the path, and you don't, as you say, you don't let these circumstances or situations be an impediment, be actually an obstacle that you cannot surmount, you surmount it. And I want to thank you very much for telling us your story, sharing it. And wow. So I'll be seeing you during the monthly meetings, and other people who might be interested in seeing you in the monthly meetings and learning about the sharing.
Okay. Thank you very much. This has been fun. Thank you.
My pleasure, truly my pleasure. And I think it will be the pleasure of many people who will relate strongly to your life and your story, your journey. So Erik Rush, thank you very much for participating, for being here with us on the UFO Report. We didn't talk much about UFOs. Every now and then we do. So thank you very much. And I'll say goodbye for now until next time. I'll just, for everybody, may we be safe and serene. And I'll say Salome until next time.
Salome, take care.
How things have gotten bad. Drugs and crime are on the climb, so they hide behind the flag. They'll trash the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. There's nowhere to hide if they decide to kick in your door tonight. Don't go along with that. The land of the free, that's the way we give away our liberty. First will be the flag, then what you can eat and drink. Next will be your attitude, what you say, here, feel, and think. Then before you know it, you're a number without a name. We're under attack, we better push back so we